This box here is where my IT career started. Paradox 5 for Windows. I was a telemarketer who didn't like making phone calls, and so I got the chance to work with this when the IT manager left. And the strange thing is, sitting down again with it nearly 30 years later, I'm surprised how much of it's still in my head. Now, if you wanted a system for sales calls, customer records, follow-ups and reports, you'd probably subscribe to a cloud CRM like Salesforce or HubSpot. In the 1990s, you couldn't subscribe to anything. You had to build it yourself. This is Borland Paradox 5, one of the most important business database products of the 1990s, and one that almost completely disappeared. In 1996, this building in Birmingham was where I got my first job in IT. My office was that window right there. The company ran on a combination of Novell NetWare and Windows for Workgroups 3.11. This was the first business computer system I was responsible for supporting. One of my responsibilities was maintaining a database system built in Paradox. The previous IT manager had left behind his code and these books, and that was pretty much my documentation. This is my first time back in Paradox in about 30 years, and I was surprised how much came back to me. It was a pretty good database system. You can see you got an option to be coached in how to use it, or you can just click and get straight into the application. What I've done here is put together a database about planning the videos for the YouTube channel. So this is the first part. You'll have a table, and here is my table information. I'm going to put that now into the form where we can see the structure of the table rather than the records like a spreadsheet. Paradox made it simple. Top there, I've got a keyed number, which means it auto increments every time I go into a new record. And then you can choose from the different types of fields that you want. The most popular field type for the work I did in telemarketing was generally alpha, typing in words and storing information in that way. The field was limited to 255 characters, so you did have to be mindful that you condensed your notes every time you updated a record of your telephone call. Once you had a table in place, next thing you did was design the form, and the form was what you used to enter the information. This was where the telemarketers would go, or in this case, where I'm going to go to update the information for my video planning database. I'm going to go into design mode, and here I can associate on-screen graphics with the table fields that we created in the table. And it's very easy with this to right-click and assign the actual table field to each of the records. This visual database structure where you could drag and drop and design and move was a real step ahead of what you'd had in previous versions of DOS databases. And for me, it just clicked in my head. I could get into this and use it. Originally, the IT manager hadn't locked down the forms so that anybody could go in and edit them. I noticed that one day while I was working, and I was then able to go in and understand how the program worked while I was meant to be making telephone calls, which is kind of how I got to learn how to use it. So I spent my days making phone calls and then learning how to use the database because the IT manager hadn't locked you out of it. And as you can see here now, it was fairly straightforward to design a nice, easy drop-down menu there. Easy fields for entering data for my video item or my video description that I'm going to type into now. And when you were telemarketing, this made it simple for all of the people who are making calls to enter the information that they were taking on the phone call while they were typing, which was really what people wanted from using a system like this rather than writing it down on paper. I was fascinated with the fact that I could change the design and look on the screen, and that there were things that I could do inside of this with buttons and other options that I had no understanding of how they worked, but I really wanted to know how they did work. And that was what drove my natural curiosity to explore this even further. In previous databases, it had been quite tricky and required a bit of coding knowledge in order to actually do a search on the databases. What you got with Paradox was something called a query, which was a visual implementation of code to look through your database. I'm going to take the video database here, and here's the query. All you had to do was click into each of the fields that you wanted to see when you ran the query, and you could link those fields together using the relational database key fields. This was something that made it really simple for somebody like me who'd never used a database before to be able to answer the questions that my managers and managing directors had about statistics in the database. How many calls were made by this person? How many of those calls that were made resulted in talking to a decision maker? How many decision makers booked a meeting? It could all be done through Paradox using the queries really easily. And it didn't take long doing this every single day for me to get into the habit of how to use this system. I guess that's similar for anybody. Before you know it, you become a bit of a whiz at it. And certainly coming back to it here on this day, I was quite pleasantly surprised that I got these feelings of remembering memories of doing certain tasks and of certain fields popping up on the screen that hadn't been in my mind for a long time. I'm going to close out of the query section now, and we can have a look at some of the other features that you could use in Paradox. I'm going to save that query with a name, and you'll note here, I'm just thinking, hang on a minute, this is Windows 3.1, so I need to change my save name to something that's going to fit into the 8.3 format. This was the trickiest thing of this operating system at this time, because look, we're going to go with total plan here, but I can't use that. It's too long a file name. So I've got to go with something smaller. And you ended up with tons and tons of files like that. Total. You had to understand what they meant. It probably even meant having a note-keeping section of what these things were meant to mean. Paradox supported importing from loads of different types of data. Generally, when I got my information, it was coming to me in a CSV file, but you had lots of options for importing it. Delimited text there being the CSV file, but you could come in from Quattro Pro, Lotus 123 or Excel. It supported all the current spreadsheet features at the time, meaning that this was really easy to plug into any business. The real thing that mattered to me though was ObjectPal, the ability to write code that would occur when you press things like my schedule shoot button here. I could write code behind the scenes so that when I clicked on that button, something would happen on the screen, or I could get it to jump records, or I could get it to look something up. And I found this fascinating because it was like, I can get a computer to do something and all I've got to do is tell it the exact instructions and it'll do what I want. This object-oriented programming meant you go into design mode, you right-click on the button, you choose its methods, it tells you what the button can do, which is push button, and then it was a matter of entering the correct code. I had to learn all of this from the ObjectPal book and by reverse engineering the XIT manager's code. To me, this was all brand new and exciting, but Paradox was already an established business tool, and the question is, how did it get to this point in the market? Well, to answer that, we need to go back to the early 1980s and to a company called Answer Software. The story of Paradox begins in Belmont, California in 1984 with the founding of Answer Software. The company was created by two computer scientists, Richard Schwartz and Robert Elliott Shostak. While Schwartz focused on the business side, Shostak was a highly respected researcher whose work stretched from automated software verification to distributed computing. Together, Schwartz and Shostak set out to build software for the rapidly growing personal computer market. Their first major product would be a database application called Paradox, and within a few years, it would become one of the most successful business software products of the 1980s. Even the name Paradox had an interesting origin. The product's name was reportedly conceived by Answer executive Dan Rosen as a joke about the company's founders. Richard Schwartz and Robert Shostak were both computer science PhDs, making them, quite literally, a paradox, or paradox. The name also reflected what Answer believed made Paradox special. At a time when many database products were aimed at programmers and technical specialists, Paradox was designed to be approachable. The company's documentation described its central paradox as a combining the power of a relational database with an interface that ordinary business users could learn and use. That idea proved to be a winning formula. Under the guidance of product manager Joe Duncan, Paradox 1.0 was released for MS-DOS in 1985. By modern standards, its requirements were tiny, needing just 512 kilobytes of memory to run. But for businesses looking to manage growing amounts of information on personal computers, Paradox offered something that was both powerful and practical. When Paradox launched in 1985, it entered a market already dominated by Ashton Tate's DBase 2 and DBase 3, but Answer believed they had a better approach. While DBase users often had to write significant amounts of code to connect information stored across multiple files, Paradox was built from the ground up as a relational database. This made it far easier to organize and work with related information spread across multiple tables. Answer also recognized that convincing businesses to switch would be difficult. To ease the transition, Paradox could import existing DBase data, allowing organizations to bring their information across without starting again from scratch. It was a smart strategy. Rather than asking businesses to abandon everything they'd already built, Paradox offered them a path to something more powerful. Paradox became even more powerful in 1986 with the introduction of the Paradox application language, better known as PAL. PAL was the built-in scripting language that allowed users to automate tasks, build applications, and extend the capabilities of the database far beyond simple data entry and reporting. What made PAL particularly approachable was the way users could create scripts. Similar to the macro facilities found in Lotus 123, Paradox could record a user's keystrokes and automatically turn those actions into editable PAL code. This gave users a practical way to learn programming by starting with something they already understood, record a task, examine the generated script, make a few changes, and gradually begin building more and more sophisticated applications. A decade later, this would be the feature that drew me into Paradox. It wasn't just a database anymore, it had become a platform for building software. It's 1987. Paradox had become successful enough to attract the attention of one of the world's fastest growing software companies, Borland International. In September of that year, Borland acquired Answer Software in an all-stock deal valued at approximately $29 million. For a company generating around $8 million in annual database revenue, it represented a remarkable success story. For Borland, the acquisition was part of a much larger ambition. The company was assembling a portfolio of business software designed to challenge the industry's biggest names. Alongside products such as Quattro Spreadsheet, Paradox will become a key part of Borland's attempt to compete with established giants like Lotus and Ashton Tate. The acquisition gave Paradox access to Borland's resources, marketing power and a growing reputation. What had started as a startup database in California was now positioned to compete on a much larger stage. At the centre of Borland stood its charismatic and unconventional founder, Philippe Kahn. Kahn was unlike the stereotypical software executive. Trained as a mathematician, he was also an accomplished musician and a competitive offshore yachtsman. Friends and colleagues often described him as energetic, ambitious, and willing to take the risks that the more cautious executives would avoid. That attitude shaped Borland's culture. Under Kahn's leadership, the company moved quickly, releasing products at an aggressive pace and challenging much larger competitors through bold pricing and rapid development cycles. Paradox was soon brought into the Borland family. Its packaging, documentation and branding were redesigned to match the rest of Borland's growing product portfolio, while development accelerated across both MS-DOS and other emerging platforms. For a time, the combination appeared to be a perfect match. Borland had acquired one of the most innovative databases on the market, and Paradox now had the backing of one of the software industry's most ambitious companies. The years immediately following the Borland acquisition were some of the most successful in Paradox's history. The original release had already established Paradox as a serious challenger in the desktop database market, winning customers with its combination of query by example, relational database technology, and impressive performance. By 1987, it had already captured a significant share of the corporate PC database market. Version 2.0 expanded the product even further. Multi-user networking support allowed teams to work with shared databases across local area networks, while the introduction of the PAL scripting language transformed Paradox from a database into a complete application development platform. Borland then pushed aggressively into the enterprise market. In 1988, Paradox was ported to IBM's OS/2 operating system, taking advantage of its multitasking capabilities and expanded memory support. Industry analysts praised the release, with some describing it as one of the first OS/2 applications compelling enough to justify moving beyond MS-DOS. By the end of the 80s, Paradox was no longer simply a successful database. It had become one of Borland's flagship business products, competing for customers ranging from individual power users to large corporate departments. But by the early 90s, the industry was facing a challenge far greater than any individual competitor. Microsoft Windows was beginning to transform personal computing. As I discussed in my video on Microsoft Delta, many software companies underestimated just how disruptive this transition would become. For years, applications had been built around the predictable text-based world of MS-DOS. Developers controlled the screen, the keyboard, and almost every aspect of the user experience. Windows changed all of that. Suddenly, software had to operate inside a graphical, event-driven environment filled with Windows menus, dialog boxes, and mouse input. Existing applications couldn't simply be ported across. In many cases, they had to be redesigned from the ground up. For Borland, creating a native Windows version of Paradox became a massive undertaking. Originally targeted for release in 1992, Paradox for Windows would not ship until January 1993. This delay had serious consequences. While Borland's engineers were still working on Paradox for Windows, Microsoft seized the opportunity to launch Microsoft Access. By the time Paradox finally arrived in January 1993, it was no longer entering an empty market. And what's fascinating, however, isn't that the delay was caused by a lack of ambition. Quite the opposite. Borland assembled a completely separate development team to create Paradox for Windows, and rather than simply recreating the DOS version, they set out to design what they believed a modern graphical database application should look like. The team adopted ideas that were remarkably forward-thinking for the time. Users could inspect and modify object properties with a right click, floating tool palettes could remain visible while working, and property sheets provided a more visual approach to application development. Many of these concepts were inspired by advanced graphical environments such as Xerox, Alto, Smalltalk, and Next Step. In many respects, the developers were building for the future. The problem was that while Borland was building an advanced Windows application, Microsoft was busy establishing its own foothold in the Windows database market. Unfortunately, the move to Windows came with a cost. The original DOS versions of Paradox had used a scripting language called PAL. It was procedural, straightforward, and familiar to the thousands of developers who'd spent years building applications around it. Paradox for Windows introduced the entirely new language called ObjectPal, the one that I started to use in '96. From a technical perspective, the decision seemed to make sense. Windows applications were event-driven rather than sequential, and the old DOS-style approach simply didn't fit the graphical world Borland was trying to build. The problem was that the existing developers suddenly found themselves facing a steep learning curve. Applications written for the DOS versions of Paradox couldn't be recompiled for Windows, much of the code had to be rewritten, and developers were forced to learn an entirely new programming model based around visual objects, forms and events. For new users, ObjectPal was powerful and modern. For many long-time Paradox developers, however, it felt as though the platform they knew had been replaced overnight. It was the first sign that Borland's vision for the future and the needs of its existing customers were beginning to drift apart. This decline of Paradox wasn't caused by a single bad product release or an engineering mistake. Instead, it was the result of a series of strategic decisions that gradually weakened Borland's position just as Microsoft was becoming more powerful. One of the most significant decisions came in '91 when Borland acquired Ashton Tate, the company behind DBase, in a deal worth approximately $439 million. At first glance, the acquisition seemed logical. DBase dominated the desktop database market, while Paradox was widely regarded as the more advanced technology. Borland believed that bringing the two companies together would create an unbeatable force in business databases. There was also a defensive element to the deal. Executives feared that if Microsoft or Lotus acquired Ashton Tate first, Borland could find itself locked out of the corporate market altogether. Unfortunately, the acquisition created as many problems as it solved. Instead of managing one successful database product, Borland suddenly found itself responsible for two competing platforms aimed at many of the same customers. The company spent enormous amounts of time and money attempting to modernise DBase for the Windows era, only to discover that the aging codebase was far more difficult to adapt than expected. At the same time, Borland faced an uncomfortable question. If it owned both DBase and Paradox, which product should it promote? And the answer turned out to be neither. In an effort to avoid directly competing with its own products, Borland gradually repositioned Paradox away from the professional developer community that had helped make it successful. The result was a dangerous middle ground. Paradox was a sophisticated development platform, but it was increasingly being marketed as an easy-to-use end-user database. For casual users, it remained intimidating, while many professional developers felt Borland's attention was shifted elsewhere. At precisely the moment Microsoft was strengthening its position, Borland had begun confusing its own customers about where Paradox belonged. Borland was occupied integrating Ashton Tate and managing two competing database products. Microsoft was pursuing a far more focused strategy. In '92, Microsoft acquired Fox Software, the company behind the highly respected Fox Pro database system. The acquisition gave Microsoft access to both talented database engineers and valuable technology. In particular, Microsoft incorporated Fox Pro's highly efficient Rushmore query optimization techniques into the Microsoft Access database engine, improving performance and strengthening Access' position in the market. The contrast between the two companies could hardly have been greater. Borland was attempting to manage Paradox, DBase and the aftermath of the acquisition. Microsoft, meanwhile, was concentrating its efforts on building a complete Windows ecosystem. As Microsoft adoption accelerated through the early 1990s, that difference in focus would prove increasingly important. Then Microsoft delivered what might have been the decisive blow. When Microsoft Access launched at Comdex in November 1992, the company introduced it at a promotional retail price of $99. To put that in perspective, Paradox for Windows and DBase were both selling for around $795. This was the knockout punch to Borland. Borland needed to generate substantial revenue for each copy of Paradox it sold. Microsoft, however, was increasingly focused on growing the Windows ecosystem and establishing Access as the standard database for Windows users. For customers, the decision became easier. Even if Paradox was technically superior, many businesses struggled to justify paying 8 times as much for a product. Suddenly, Borland wasn't just fighting a battle over features, it was fighting a battle over economics. The final turning point arrived in 1995. By this point, Microsoft was no longer competing with Paradox as a standalone database product. Instead, it was leveraging the growth dominance of the entire Microsoft Office ecosystem. Access was bundled directly into Microsoft Office alongside Word, Excel and PowerPoint. This changed the economics of the market overnight. For many businesses, the question was no longer which database should we buy. Instead, it became why would we buy a separate database at all? Once Access arrived as part of the software suite that many organisations were already purchasing, the market for premium standalone desktop databases began to shrink rapidly. Paradox remained capable and in many respects technically impressive, but it was now competing against something much larger than Access itself. It was competing against the momentum of Microsoft Office, and that was a battle very few software companies of the 1990s managed to win. The reason for Paradox's decline were becoming increasingly clear. Borland had lost valuable time during the transition from DOS to Windows and became distracted by the costly acquisition of Ashton Tate. The financial pressure on Borland was made worse by a decision that would later become symbolic of the company's changing fortunes. In 1993, at the height of its success, Borland completed construction of a new corporate headquarters in Scotts Valley, California. The campus reportedly cost around $120 million to build. The headquarters did not cause Paradox to fail. However, it consumed a vast amount of capital at precisely the moment Borland needed resources to defend its market position. While the company was struggling with the integration of Ashton Tate, competing database strategies, and Microsoft's increasingly aggressive push into the Windows market, millions of dollars were tied up in a landmark corporate campus. Looking back, the building became a powerful symbol of the era. It was constructed when Borland appeared unstoppable, yet was completed just as the foundations of the company's success were beginning to shift. While Borland was invested in a monument to its achievements, Microsoft was reshaping the software industry around Windows and Office. The result was one of the most innovative software companies of the 1980s entered the second half of the 1990s, fighting not from a position of strength, but from a position of defence. The struggle for the desktop database market was effectively over by late 1995. Following growing disagreements with the board over the future direction of the company, Philip Kahn resigned as Borland CEO, President and Chairman in 1995. The departure marked the end of an era for a leader who had helped transform Borland into one of the most influential software companies of the 1980s and early 90s. Faced with mounting financial pressure and a changing market, Borland began retreating from the Office applications business that had once been central to its ambitions. In October 1994, the company sold its Quattro Pro spreadsheet business and licensed the rights to sell at 1 million copies of Paradox to Novell in a deal worth approximately $140 million. The transaction provided much needed cash while allowing Borland to focus increasingly on its developer tools business. The process continued in 1996 when Borland sold the entire Paradox product line to the Corel Corporation. Responsibility for Paradox's development, marketing and support passed to Corel, while Borland retained ownership of the underlying Borland database engine technology. The sale marked the end of Paradox's journey as a Borland product. What had begun as an innovative startup database in California and had become one of the flagship products of a major company was now passing into the hands of a new owner. Paradox itself would continue to survive for many years, but its era as a major force in the database market had effectively come to an end. Paradox never completely disappeared. Even today, Corel continues to include Paradox with certain professional editions of WordPerfect Office. However, the software has received very little fundamental development in many years and is now firmly considered a legacy platform. One of the challenges facing organisations that still possess old Paradox databases is that the underlying file format was never fully documented. As a result, modern database systems cannot easily import native Paradox tables, making migration projects surprisingly difficult. In some cases, developers have had to reverse engineer the file format itself, using specialist tools and open source libraries to extract decades-old business data and move it into modern SQL database systems. For a product that once represented the cutting edge of desktop database technology, it is a reminder of how quickly the software industry can move on.